So, hello everybody. I want to welcome you first for our second lecture in the series dedicated to modern Assyrian histories, cultures. And civilizations, and it's my very and again we are the series has been made possible through a generous and incredibly generous donation from the Assyrian Universal Alliance Foundation. And we want to express our gratitude to the donors once more for enabling us to engage in this kind of series of conversation that has been going on for 2 years right now with major scholars in the field. It is with the aims of the series in mind that we have that it's a very distinct pleasure and honor to introduce you to introduce you today, Professor Helen Muir van den Berg, who is a professor of comparative religious studies. And what she's done in the last decade and more is really establishing a field in Europe, but also in a way that influenced profoundly the American Academy in Middle Eastern Studies more generally. So she is a scholar of Syria, Chaldean, and Assyrian communities, and how they represent themselves, how others represent them, how they engage with different groups like missionaries, like travelers. And for scholars of the Middle East, what she's done is to sort of almost rescue Neo-Aramaic dialects and languages that were perceived as essential to the late antique period, to antiquity, and show their tremendous importance to the modern Middle East, and how in many ways you can write the history of places like Iraq or Iran or sites like Urmia without taking into account these languages. So she's been working on scribal practices in senses where the script and the language match and don't match, on the relationship between print culture, manuscript culture, and identity formation, on modern religious practices. So what happens to communities in the 20th century with various competitions from other religious groups. What happens to these communities in the era of imperial reform in the Ottoman Empire, of colonialism, of colonial intervention, of nationalism. And so if I read to you all of her publications, we would be here a long time, and she has to give us a talk, and it's nighttime in Europe. But I'll just mention a very recent book that is actually open access, so you guys can check it out later on. Arabic and its alternatives, religious minorities and their languages in emerging nation states of the Middle East, which she co-edited. There's another important co-edited volume from 2016. The one that I've mentioned is from 2000, called Modernity, Minority, and the Public Sphere, Jews and Christians in the Middle East. And again, a series of impressive award-winning articles, grants, and fellowships. So we're very thankful that she's here, and the floor is yours. And again, welcome virtually to Chicago.
Thank you so much, Oded. It's nice to see you here again, and it's so great to see you all. At least for now, the names on the screen. I will start sharing my screen and see whether that works. Let me see. But if I share the screen now, I'll have to see where. Now I have to see whether. Do you see my PowerPoint?
We see it.
And if I move it, is it moving?
No.
So probably then I'm sharing it the wrong way. So I will just. Stop share for a minute. And yeah, there's two ways of sharing, and it's always a bit complicated to have the. Let me see. What is the best one here? Is it moving now?
No, but can you press the slide number 2, for example?
Yeah, I do. So that's.
Um,
So you see the not that. Oh, sorry for this.
oh, here we go. Yeah, so now it moved to slide number 2.
So it's probably just slow rather than.
Yeah.
Let's hope it continues. So give me kind of a sign on it when it doesn't move at all.
Okay.
Then,
Okay.
yeah. I'm really very grateful to be here in Chicago. I'm also very excited to see so many of the Assyrian community. I wanted to start with Shlamalochun. I'm so happy to be here. And I just mentioned to Orit that when I was preparing for this lecture, I realized that it is about 26 years ago, when as a fresh PhD, I came to Chicago and was generously invited, I think by then the Assyrian academic journal to give a lecture for the Assyrians of Chicago, and it made a big impression on me. And I'm really glad that in a way this is I can see this as a follow-up on that, in the connection between the Assyrians and the University of Chicago. So I'm really grateful for this invitation. So what I want to do today is kind of take a broad view of the history of the Assyrians, and especially of the Church of the East, and trying to map how some of the larger issues that I think are part of the Church of the East in the past and in the present, connect or maybe not connect, and how they develop, comparing the Church of the East also to some of the other churches. So I hope that you now see the image of this somewhat dilapidated church in the Hakkari Mountains, and this church is can stand for some a certain way of looking at the Church of the East as a kind of very vulnerable, small, fragile church that, in a sense, is no longer part of the big historic changes. And the way Orit introduced me just now already indicates that that's not an image I would share, but still it is there, and it is there also in many ways in how people in the West, especially when they come across this church, have difficulty in positioning it. And so this image of a very small and vulnerable church is often part of it. However, as many of you here know, that is of course only one part of the picture. Though the church is relatively small, there is no doubt about it, it is also very spread out thin globally, which on the one hand, of course, means that there are not that many locations where you have a lot of Assyrians in one place, or a lot of members of the Church of the East. That's, of course, not always the same thing. But they are in many, many places in the world. They have been very well connected. They are a long-term member of the World Council of Churches, for example, has yet still not accepted by the Middle East Council of Churches. That's a sore point for many people of the Assyrian Church of the East, but at the same time entertaining this strong and widely spread ecumenical network with the Roman Catholic Church, Anglicans, various Protestant churches, various Orthodox churches. So there's this interconnections of the Church of the East. The new patriarch, Mar Awa, builds upon the work which was already started by Mar Saliba, and returning the patriarchate, which has been in Chicago for such a long period, to return the patriarchate to Iraq. I'm curious to hear more from people from Chicago how they view that, but in my sense, whatever you think of it globally, it also means that there is this vibrancy in the Church of the East that on the one hand wants to keep the connections with Iraq, but at the same time with Mar Awa, who of course has strong connections to the US and the diaspora, to maintain this balance. And this is, I think, the thing that I would like to work out a bit more. Also, because there is one other aspect that I find very interesting here, is on the one hand, this ongoing and very strong link with Assyrian ethnicity and culture, language, Assyrian political and cultural organizations, media, TV channels, websites, and of course the family ties, but at the same time, the church is not unique only and exclusively Assyrian in the ethnic sense. It also includes the contingent of members in India, and of course over the world as a whole, members of other ethnic communities. I've been doing a study of The Voice of the East. Some of you may know that, a magazine that is produced in India, but also functions as a magazine for the Assyrian of the Church in a wider sense. So what I'm going to do today is to bring these aspects of the Assyrian of the Church of the East in conversation with a bit of the history of the church, to show how some of these kind of various elements were already there or not, or in a different way. These questions are partly brought up by a research project that at this point I'm directing in Nijmegen at Radboud University, which I've styled Rewriting Global Orthodoxy, Oriental Christianity in Europe between 1970 and 220, which is, let me see, I see the slides are still not moving. Let me see what else I can do. Sorry guys for this. I'm having not a bad Zoom day today. Let's so do you see my
Yeah, but I think you need to press on presentation mode, which is
yeah.
Okay, yeah, it's moving.
But now you see probably, let's see whether it also works when I have the full screen. No, huh?
No.
Exactly. Now let's keep it then at this one. Then
Okay.
we're having.
Okay, that's better.
It's not ideal, but it's better than.
Okay,
than
wonderful.
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the project now, I'll just move. So this project, what we're working on is working on the Oriental Christians in Europe. So the Syriac Orthodox, Copts, Ethiopians, Armenians, and looking at the literature they are producing at this point. Literature in the sense of books, booklets, liturgies, translations, everything that is related to the churches. So we are kind of leaving the nationalist, the political organizations and stuff like that a bit on the side. In this project, we're looking from the perspective of the churches and see how they are kind of positioning themselves in the European context. And this project, in fact, also made me rethink a bit about how I look at the Assyrian Church of the East, which is officially not part of the project, but because I find it of course, I keep working on it, and I think it's very important to kind of compare what's happening in the Church of the East with what is happening in these Oriental Orthodox churches. And you see that there is many similarities, of course, but also quite some differences in how, for example, things like communal identifications, ethnicity in relation to church, how that works. The issue of ecumenism is slightly different, and maybe also, but that's something we're still in the kind of initial phases, how these churches and their members deal with secular modernities, both the secularity as such and with the whole norms and values discussion. So that brings us back to the Church of the East in its transnational and global iterations. And I will go back into history, looking particularly at what we call ecclesiology, so that the way in which people speak about what the church is, about church and politics, to church and state. And of course, and here it's always difficult to be sure what the issues are, in the sense like explaining what happens. You can explain that from certain ideologies regarding the church, regarding church and politics. But there is, of course, also the historical contingencies that these churches have to deal with. So some of the particularities of the ACE are very particular to the region, to the times, but I don't think all of that is just contingency. I think there's more to that. So let's move back in history. I'm not, of course, not dealing with every period in great detail. That would take us far too much time. But if we think of the origins of the church in Mesopotamia, we start off with what is clearly an Aramaic base in Mesopotamia, but already from the very beginning, there is the Persian context and also quite early on connections to the Persian language. There is periods of persecution and ongoing growth and extending the Church of the East into Central Asia, China, and India. And so already here you see that how the Church of the East develops is really very different from especially the Syriac Orthodox Church, which in many ways is the closest, and it's really different. Not to say that the Syriac Orthodox Church did not also have some connections into Central Asia and India, but cannot be compared to the history of the Church of the East here. And what you see here is the Dakin stele in China, which was discovered in the 16th century, but which dates from the, now I should have checked it, but from the 8th century, but already refers to an earlier period in China. What you see here, so is both the multilingual aspect of the Church of the East and I would say a willingness to engage with the powers that be. So it's not only about many people in contemporary studies of the Middle Eastern churches have ascribed to them a certain creatism, being kind of aloof from politics and staying away from the politics because you're a minority, and a church which is not really, which kind of keeps away from the powers that be. I don't think that is true for the Church of the East. I mean, they have in certain periods of time, but they're always, when there were possibilities to engage with the powers that be, they have done so, whether it was in China or in the Middle East or in other places. If we now look at this period, what we call the Abbasid period, 8th, early 9th century, there's this interesting figure of Timothy the Great, and he is one of the persons that started to think a bit more explicitly about what it means to be the Church of the East. We use that very easily, but it is a term with a long history, and people really thought about that. And there has been, and until today, there is a line in the Church of the East that recognizes the 5 patriarchates, the original centers of the Christian church as it developed in the Roman Empire, with Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria as the main centers, and then with Baghdad, Babylon added to that. In many of these discussions, still Rome was the most important of these patriarchates, and the Church of the East always kind of easily didn't find it difficult to accept Rome and the Pope of Rome as kind of the major figure of the worldwide church. And what you see with Timothy, that on the one hand, he does accept this image that you have this regional church, which is located in various places of the world and which each have a responsibility for a certain part of the church. So his church obviously is the Church of the East. But it's interesting that Timothy starts to think and kind of argue for a primacy, for an originality of exactly the Church of the East. And so he starts arguing that because Peter, the Apostle Peter, in one of his letters writes from, he writes that he is writing from Babylon, and then Timothy says Babylon, that stands is the same as Baghdad, and clearly Peter was in Baghdad, in Babylon, before he moved to Rome. So Babylon, Baghdad is more important than Rome in the scheme of things. And then he adds stories about, of course, the 3 wise men, the kings from the east, the Magi, He talks about the rivers of paradise. And so he has this whole story about why the East, whether the rest of the church acknowledges that or not, is in a sense more important than the patriarchates of Rome and Constantinople. So you see here, and I'm not, that's not something I came up with, but you see here how Timothy uses these elements from history, from the Bible, to make sure that his church is seen by the people in the Middle East, but maybe also wider. We don't know exactly how wide this was, as a church with a responsibility for the East, and then he clearly includes Central Asia, China, and India in that, and as a counterpart, as an equal partner to the church in the West. So if we now move to the Mongol period, as some of you will know, after this period of expansion under Timothy, gradually the dioceses in the East diminished, became smaller, some of them disappeared completely. But in the 12th, 13th century, again under the Mongols, there were again opportunities for the Church of the East to expand into Asia. And under Mongol rule, the Church of the East spread again far into China, to various parts of China, to the south of China, to the center of China. And then again, like in the earlier periods, the Church of the East very much was a multilingual church with, in addition to Syriac, there was Persian, Sogdian, classical Chinese, Turkic languages, which were spoken and written by these Christians. We don't know for sure, but it's quite likely that in many places the liturgy only remained kind of partly in Syriac, but also included these other languages in the liturgy. One of the very interesting sources of this period that tells us a bit more is the history of Patriarch Maria Vallaha and Rabban Sauma, two monks from China who traveled all the way to well, they wanted to go to Jerusalem, but when they arrived in Baghdad, it was clear that the Patriarch wanted to keep them in Baghdad. The times were also difficult, so they were advised against traveling to Jerusalem. They found it too dangerous. But it's clear from the story that the then Patriarch really wanted them to stay with him and with the church in the center. And after some years, when this Patriarch died, the church elected Maria Vallaha as his successor, with a clear reason that Maria Vallaha was well connected to the Mongol rulers. He knew the language, and they have in a side note, his Syriac was not of a very high level, but he knew the Turkic and the Mongolian, so he was seen as a fit to be a patriarch. And he probably was. He reigned for a long period, 1282 to 1317, and this history, in a sense, tries to document his reign. Interesting in this whole document, which in the larger sense you can see as a kind of hagiography of Maria Vallaha. At the same time, it includes a trip from Rabban Sauma as an envoy of both Maria Vallaha and the Mongol ruler. So here again you have the politics and the church in one, to Europe. So he traveled first to Byzantium, to Constantinople, to Rome, and to Paris, and to Bordeaux even, to discuss both with clerical and political rulers the position of the Mongols vis-a-vis the European countries. He was at the Pope in Rome discussing theology with the cardinals. So this is a very, very interesting story. There might be embellishments and kind of blown up stories in it, but overall it is a very interesting document that probably was expanded and revised and kind of edited by Timothy II, the successor of Maria Vallaha. But the text itself is anonymous, but Timothy seems to be the most likely kind of author of the whole thing and editor parts of it. This story ends with the fall of Erbil in 1310. That was a dramatic moment for the Church of the East, where the political skills of Maria Wallaha were not able to rescue the Christians of Erbil from a massacre that was incited by one of the local rulers. In earlier times, if there were such tensions, the Mongols were always able to negotiate that and make sure that the Christians didn't come to evil. But in the years after 1300, this slowly became more and more difficult. And the fall of Erbil in 1310 is described by Timothy as a turning moment in the history of the Church of the East. From then, it starts getting worse and worse. And as we see the whole history, we see also that this is indeed the end of a period in which the Church of the East had this world church expansion. One other important figure of this time is Odisho Barbriga. And whereas the text of Maria Wallaha and Rabban Sauma was not really, didn't have a big kind of resonance, it was rediscovered late in the 19th century, but it wasn't read widely as far as we can see. The works of Odisho Barbriga have become very important for the Church of the East, and he is one of the authors, both in his Marganitha and Odaisa, and that has had a big influence on the theology of the Church of the East. And Odisho, interestingly enough, he returns in a sense to acknowledge Rome as the first of the patriarchates. But again, in the same line as Timothy, seeing the Church of the East really as part of the world church, as the part that is responsible for the eastern parts of the church, as you also see Rabban Sauma discuss in his discussions in Rome. Both Maria Wallaha and Odisho were very much interested in connections with Rome. So they talk about a union. And in fact, if we go to the next slide, so just for those who don't know, this is one of these gravestones that are found in Central Asia, where you see a Syriac script, but the language in fact is Turkic. So it looks like Syriac, but it isn't. But here's the word Kora, gravestone, which was borrowed in full in this language. If we now go, so to round off this part on the church in the Mongol period, you see that there is clearly an interest in these global connections again. There is the attempt to kind of get a foothold in Jerusalem, which is, I'm writing here, unsuccessful, not quite sure about it. In that period, the Church of the East was present in Jerusalem, but it doesn't seem to have been a very strong presence. Interestingly enough, and I haven't quite found out why that is the case, but Byzantium and Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarch of Byzantium, doesn't seem to exert a lot of interest and from the people from the Church of the East, probably because they considered him kind of less important than the Pope in Rome, and probably also because the Mongols were much more interested in connections with Europe than with Byzantium. So these two together probably kind of explain the big interest in getting their relations with the Pope strained. And they did to some extent. What you see on the right hand, if you can see it, there's a text in both Syriac, I'm not sure, Arabic and Persian and Mongolian, where the connection between Maria Wallaha and Rome are being described. This with the seal also of Maria Wallaha. This period ends in disaster, as you will know, and the movement of the Mongols, Timur-Leng. There's a lot of migration going on, probably, but we don't have actual proof of it. We just see the results, a lot of conversions, probably forced conversions. And at the end of this period, where around 1300 there were still Christians from India to China up to Mesopotamia and further into Syria, what is left around, say, 1400, 1450 is only a small community, a relatively small community in Kurdistan, in North Mesopotamia, Eastern Persia. eastern, what is today Turkey, and of course the community in India. That is relatively untouched by all the things that happen at the end of the Mongol period. So I'm trying to be a little bit quick with seeing how where we are time-wise, but I now move into the Ottoman period. And in the Ottoman period, you see, in fact, just before, that's very interesting, just before the Ottoman period starts for North Iraq, in the early decades of the 16th century, you see gradually this North Iraq Patriarchate around Rabban Hormizd, Mosul, Gazarta, Jizre in eastern Turkey, you see it kind of coming back. And one of the first signs are the letters written between India and North Iraq. So what you see around 1600, that not only the Church of the East in North Iraq, if we use the modern terms, becomes more active, we see more manuscripts, we just have more text of this period. You also see then the connections with India being re-established. So the Church of the East in India then reconnects with the church in Mesopotamia. The Patriarch then sends priests to India and have them consecrated as bishops. And so there's a start of connections. And these reconnections, to some extent, are being kind of fueled by the fact that the Portuguese had arrived in India, and the Portuguese were interested in these Christians and also kind of brought Catholicism to them. So you see all these things coming together, reconnecting various places, the interest in Europe, the interest in Portugal, and the interest in the Catholic Church. And so from the mid-16th century, these connections also lead to the influence of the Catholics, what we often call the Uniatism, and which leads to the emergence of the Chaldean Church in North Iraq and eastern Turkey. So this is a bit of a checkered history with the first union in the mid-16th century. Then the followers of the successors of Johannan Sulaka again revert back to the Church of the East. There's other attempts in the 16th and 17th centuries. In the 17th century, there's Mar Yusuf in Diyarbakir, in Hamid, who succeeds in establishing a stable Chaldean patriarchate. And in the end, in the 19th century, finally, you have what is the kind of the predecessor of the current Chaldean patriarchate, with the Church of the East Patriarchate by that time located in Kochanes in Hakkari. Now you can look at this Catholic movement as a kind of church history, which is maybe not too interesting for those who are more interested in cultural or political movements. But in my opinion, these movements are very important also as part of kind of a reconnecting of the Church of the East with the rest of the world. And they do that in all kinds of ways, and reconnecting with Rome and with the West is part of it. What is also part of it is a huge attempt at book production, a huge investment in book production. There's an enormous rise and increase of numbers of manuscripts. And you see also the first traces of the writing of modern Aramaic or Surah in this period. Alongside, that's the third element, so you see more classical Syriac, you see Surah, and you see Arabic. So from a very kind of low-level literary engagement, you see a huge growth in the 16th and especially in the 17th century of writing, in fact, in 3 languages rather than in 1. And for a long time, I thought that this was a kind of specific development within the Church of the East, but in fact, it's clear that in all of the Middle East in this period, there is this increase in literary activities. Some people, a long time ago, when I started researching these things, completely thought this is all the Catholic influence, but it's clearly not. I mean, there is definitely Catholic influence in what is being published, but at the same time, the influence is also kind of local, and there is this interest in publishing, which I think also made people interested in what the Catholic Church had on offer. but it's not necessarily that everything comes from the Catholics here. So I think it's very much in the region. You also see in Mosul, for example, among the Arabic manuscript production, you see a huge increase in exactly the same period. So there's more to it in the region than just Western or Catholic influence. What is an interesting issue in this regard is also the role of Arabic. So you see here, for the first time after the period in both among the Mongols, Abdishu Babricha was also very prolific in Arabic, and earlier writers in the Church of the East used Arabic to a large extent because it was just such an important language. But that almost completely disappeared in the 14th, 15th century, but you see it gradually kind of returning again. And of course, the interesting thing is that Arabic as a religious, as a Christian language was taken up in other parts of the Middle East, also again in this period, and you see it especially among the Chaldeans. So you can think of whether the impetus for Catholicism and the impetus for using Arabic and writing in Arabic were probably the same or similar, or whether those who were Arabic speaking were more interested also in the Catholic connections. I don't think there's a one-to-one connection to any of these, but it's clear also part of the same cultural revival, renewal that led to manuscript production, to reading, and also to new types of involvement in the Arabic literature. So some of it is here. The interest in the Catholic Church, in my opinion, yes, it can be seen as a kind of theological and spiritual search for a renewal of the church. That's definitely part of it, especially in the later years. Marius II from Diyarbakir, for example, it's clear that he is really engaging with the Catholic theology. But as I said, it definitely also has something to do with this search for education, for literary development, maybe for connecting in the wider world. And in the beginning, it's also very clear that it has to do with political protection, with perhaps getting back to Jerusalem and find a place in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Resurrection, and have a place for the Assyrians there. So here are a couple of the aspects of the influence of the Catholics. The last thing to mention here is then the enormous influence, or the global connections that appear and become stronger. So there is India, which I already mentioned, Europe, Rome, France, Italy, and I should have mentioned Portugal here as well. Just to remind you also of Latin America, there's the famous story of Elias Khoury, which is now much better known than a couple of years ago. There's Jean-Paul Gobrial, who worked on that, and it's a fascinating story of an Assyrian, or probably a Chaldean from Mosul, who traveled around the world, and especially in Latin America. And we're not quite to the bottom of what he was exactly doing, but it's a fascinating story, and it just shows you that there probably were many more who were traveling, despite the fact that we don't know all of their names. So this whole kind of network of connections was built up again, with Jerusalem and the Levant also part of it. Aleppo is a place to mention here as well. Again, clearly the center is still in North Iraq, a little bit of Iran, but mostly North Iraq, and of course Hakkari, the Van province of the Ottoman Empire, so the mountains and the plains around Mosul, but with all these global connections. So I'm trying to wrap up and say a few things about the 20th and 21st century Church of the East. I know that this series is mostly about the modern period. I noted a couple of very interesting papers coming also on this topic. So I'll say a few things and we can discuss more about it in a minute. Of course, the genocide of 1915, 1918, and also the Semele massacre in Iraq in 1933 gave a huge impetus to a further round of dispersal, diaspora, no longer just for political or intellectual reasons, but also purely for safety, finding a better home than in Turkey or in Iraq. And so this started and strengthened the worldwide dispersion of the Church of the East. In the Middle East, of course, Syria, Lebanon, but also US, Europe, and later also Australia. So if you look at it now, and now I'm referring also to this study that I did of the Voice of the East, which is published by Mar Apram in India, you see that there is, if you look at the locations where the Church of the East has this long history and where, which are still seen as a kind of center, it is Iraq and India. And despite all the problems in Iraq over the past 20 years, I'm really surprised in how important Iraq still is for the Church of the East. What you don't see, and that is definitely has to do with kind of the perspective of Mar Apram, is what exactly the diasporas in the US and Australia and Europe are adding to this. And so this is something that I think needs more work to see how that develops, and maybe some of you present can reflect on that as well. What is interesting, if you look at it from the perspective of India, that of course Australia then is much closer, and there's a lot more attention to Australia than to the US, if you look at it from that perspective. But again, I find it interesting that a lot of the patterns of the early period you see replicated in the 20th century. Of course, some of you will know this picture, and here in the middle is Dr. Yusuf Kaleta, who was very important in education in Iraq in the 20s and 30s, but he also had his strong connections with India, so that also brings Iraq and India together. As a pre-final slide, on one of the websites of the Assyrian Church of the East, I found this very kind of interesting quote, which in fact brought all these themes together that I have been discussing so far, in the sense of how the Assyrian Church of the East, and clearly also the clergy, the ones in the lead at the moment, look at the role of the Assyrian Church of the East, both as an ethnic church, which is Assyrian, but which at the same time is the church in the lands east of the ancient Roman Empire. So it's not merely the church of the Assyrians, but it's a church of a region where you have people from many different backgrounds. So the missionary context and the missionary origins of the church, the Christians of the Middle East and India have called their faith the Holy Catholic Apostolic Church of the East. And Catholic, of course, stands for universal. So it's not merely a church of one particular people, but it's a universal church in the eastern parts. And so there's a nice picture of the church in Trishul with the previous patriarch to show again this connection. So let me conclude. The church is very ecumenical in all kinds of ways. Maybe not in all ways, but it's ecumenical in its outlook. And I think that is very much based on what I referred to just now, the apostolic and Catholic foundation. So it always has seen itself as part of a larger world church, but a part that has its own authenticity in the East and with the Eastern connections, but now also worldwide. It is, again, increasingly multi-ethnic. Iraq is back in the center, although we have to see how that will work out, but it remains thoroughly transnational, and it is, and it has been always politically active at all kinds of levels. And I think we can say a lot about that as well. I left that out a bit in this first overview, and I'll leave it at that. And thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Great. So we'll open it up for questions if people want to um, ask questions. They could either write it in the chat or raise the hand, like I did right now on my icon, which you can do through reactions. If you press the reaction icon and you press lower hand or raised hand. So um, let's wait for questions. But since we started, maybe I'll start with the first one until folks gather. Oh, there's a question. So um, um, you can see it in the chat. Where can someone find the writings about the Chaldean priest who spent time in Latin America? What was his name?
So the name is, I'm just writing in the, so we call him usually Elias Khoury, and we're not quite sure. Khoury, of course, refers to priest. Whether it was his family name, he probably also was a priest himself. So that's and the two authors who wrote most about him are Nabil Matar and Jean-Paul Gabriel. So if you're looking for authors via Google or these are the names you should look for, and then I hope you can find more about him. He's a fascinating figure. He needs even more research than has been done so far, but he's absolutely fascinating.
So I had a question about two questions. One is about bilingualism and multilingualism. So how much do we know about the languages that the Assyrian community spoke, in addition to the speaking language? So are we also talking about Latin? What about Ottoman? What about Arabic? Because I know you also dealt with a multi-scribal tradition.
Yeah.
And the second question is, what about print? Because there's the assumption that print changes a lot of things, and you highlighted this in your talk. But we also know that minority communities started the print in the Ottoman Empire way before the state joins in the 19th century, and that obviously creates other trans-regional, transnational opinions. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on the other languages that folks knew, and how does print play a role here, especially before the 19th century?
Yeah. Multilingualism, I think that's such a broad question that I'm not quite sure where to start. But I think it's there. My sense is that there would have been very few Assyrians that would have known only one language. Maybe a few people who were living in the Hakkari Mountains, but I assume that most of them would have known some Kurdish because they lived among the Kurds. So everyone who went outside his or her village needed some Kurdish. So I'm quite sure that there is a multilingualism even there. So the ones who lived in the Ottoman Empire, especially the higher levels, must have known some Ottoman Turkish, but I have no proof of that. So there's proof of Kurdish because there are also some Kurdish songs, for example. There's proof of Arabic at various levels. And then, so you would have then Arabic alongside classical Syriac for priests, etc., and alongside the spoken Assyrian, the spoken modern Aramaic. And then there is, let me think, Latin I don't know, in the sense that, yes, there were Assyrians who became Catholics and studied in Rome, so I'm sure they learned both Italian and Latin. But I'm not sure, I've never come across whether, for example, this Yusuf II, who was a very prolific author, in the late 18th century, where I've never saw proof that he knew Latin. So I doubt it, but I'm sure this is Elias Khoury. He must have known some Latin because he was so well traveled and in touch with Catholic priests, etc. As to printing, before the 19th century, that was very, very limited. So they imported some printed books from Rome. So it's really in the 19th. So I left the whole Protestant thing and the 19th century out of this story, not to make it too long. But so the printing before the 19th century was mostly import from Rome or sometimes from Syria, from Lebanon, where there was a bit of printing. But most of it was imported. But in fact, what they did was copying and writing, the traditional manuscript techniques were working very well for what they wanted to do at the time, and the manuscripts increased enormously in the period.
Okay, great. And so you have a couple of questions in the chat already. So
Nice, yeah. You can see someone commenting on the presence in Iraq. That already, Madinha. Yeah, that, thanks. Yeah. Thank you for that. And it's very interesting because, we'll see with the unstable situation in Iraq, where at some point in the 2000s it looked fairly well in North Iraq, and then it became again more difficult. And so yeah, let's see how that works out. Thank you. And I see.
And Aidan made a comment about a translated book from the Spanish with documents.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Yeah, I see. Yeah.
About the Telkepe in the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
The member of the Kasrab family. Yeah.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Thank you, Aidan, and nice to meet you again via Zoom. And I know there is research. I don't know, Orit, maybe you came across Farah Bazi. Yeah. So she's not working on the Assyrians, but the whole kind of Middle East to Latin America, Middle America migration is getting new attention at the moment. I think there's a lot of interesting work there, and so let's hope that also the Assyrian migration gets some attention in what's going on there. So thank you. Yeah. Here's some other. Yes, so the image was indeed the school by Yusuf Kuleta. Yes. Yeah. And that's up in Massif. Yeah. So thank you all for your questions and comments. Yeah.
Yeah. So are there any other questions, comments? Things that people want to ask or add? Okay, so if not, again, Thomas put in the chat again our deep thanks to wait. There's a question. I see the hand of Abdul Masih. So go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, Shlomo Malfonito, Helen. Thank you very much for the great overview. Actually, it catch my attention this travel from the two patriarchs to the west. Is there any specific study written about this beside the travelogue?
You mean the Rabban Talma story?
Yes.
Yeah. There's quite a bit of work, and it has by now also been translated into English. So the main author here, I'll try whether I can put it in chat, is Pier Giorgio Borbone, who's really the author to look for. And he started to work in Italian mostly, but some of his work is now translated into English, so that's important. I did one article, so if you send me a message, I can send you the article.
I will do so. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I just a small note that I noted in the thanks to the donors that. I don't see him here now, but if you see Dr. Mark Mikaditsyan, thank him because he was very, very generous to me on my very first visit to Chicago. So it's nice to see his name, and also to the others. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, all right. I'm just looking very quickly to see if anybody's asking questions. All right, so if we have no further questions, let us thank again our very generous donors, but also Helen for her fascinating talk. And we hope to see you in the coming weeks, where we're joined by guests from Seattle and Australia, and an in-person event in May. So thank you all very much for joining. And yeah, and we'd love to see you again. And thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.
Bye.